Hello, and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview authors and do a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. Now, this week's episode is a little different. So normally I interview an author and we have a really awesome conversation about the books that they've written and the themes and issues that they explore. But today there is no guest. It's just me. I thought I'd take the time to reflect on the past year of the show. The podcast is now over a year old. I launched it in July 2022, and to date we've had over 40 episodes live. And it has been a whirlwind of an experience. But I really wanted to reflect on some of the conversations that have taken place, the guests that have come on the show, why it's so important, and where I hope we'll go from here. I'd never hosted a podcast before. I'm an avid podcast listener, a huge reader, as I'm sure you already know. And I love speaking to authors. I've always felt like there must be so much more behind the finished book that I read. Often I consume a book in a day or a few days or a week or maybe 2 weeks. But I know that it takes the author so much longer to do that. So from a really young age, I've been intrigued in getting into the mind of those that write. I write a lot myself as well and absolutely love doing so. But I am really in awe of those that have written books that have gone out into the world and have connected with the hearts and minds of readers all over the world. But before thinking about whether or not I wanted a space just to connect with authors, I wanted to think about the particular space I wanted to create. So the Diverse Bookshelf podcast isn't just about connecting with authors. It's not just about promoting or talking about certain books. It's about creating a space for marginalized voices. I care so deeply about representation and think that until we have accurate, kind, fair representation of minority communities that include Muslim women like myself, but also all kinds of people of colour, refugees, people from minority backgrounds and groups, until we have the right representation, we're always going to be facing stereotypes and myths and incorrect perceptions that lead to hatred and on a wider scale can lead to really harmful foreign policy or domestic policy, or how we approach education, or how we approach community cohesion and welcoming refugees or not. And these things are huge. They will have massive ramifications for years and generations to come. And so this space has always been about creating a small change and a small difference about how certain communities, certain minority communities are perceived. I think as well, growing up, I never saw fair representation of people that look like me and come from the same background that I do, both in terms of like ethnically, but also from a class perspective. And I've been really intrigued in thinking about what we can do to help more young people feel seen and supported and understood, so they're not constantly battling so much as they're also dealing with growing up and trying to form a life for themselves. So I really hope that this podcast is a space where we're dealing with some of life's huge questions with regards to how society should be set up, what kind of ideas should triumph over others, the dignity and the value of human life above all. And I hope that as listeners, you are introduced to authors you may not have heard of before, or heard about books that you haven't seen with huge marketing campaigns. So the authors that have been on the show this year so far have ranged from being independently published authors, or authors published with small indie presses, and those with large mainstream publishers. Also authors that have small marketing budgets and and almost nothing, and authors that have much bigger ones. I don't discriminate when it comes to things like that. What I'm really interested in is the conversations that we can bring forth. I have loved every single conversation that I have had as part of the show. I have never left a recording feeling anything other than inspired or moved. And I reflect so much on the conversations that have happened. And what you listen to is pretty much everything that's recorded. I don't really have anything that I hold back on, or that I haven't had to remove anything massive from any of the recordings. So it's a pretty true account of what the conversation that actually happens as we are recording. And it's just been so amazing. I have learned so much. I have also had my own views and opinions challenged. And I hope that as readers and listeners, you too have. I hope that some of the conversations have encouraged you to look into something a little bit more, or to rethink the way that you thought about something, or even to revisit how you felt about a book. These things are huge, and I love the fact that this space enables us to do that. So I started the podcast in July 2022, and I'd been sitting on the idea for a good few months. And I'm so glad that I finally bit the bullet and did it. But I had recorded 2 episodes before the first one dropped. And the biggest thing I'm so grateful for is the fact that I had an outpouring of support from authors, but also readers and friends and book bloggers when I said I wanted to start a podcast. It's so difficult to start something new, especially for something a little bit creative and something you've never done before. But it makes the world of difference to know that there are people that believe in you. And I had authors that were willing to be interviewed and wanted to be interviewed when they hadn't even seen what kind of interviewer I am. That level of trust, I have held it very close to my heart and in such high regard, because it is the thing that gave me the energy to keep going. Some of the things that we've talked about on the show this year have not been for the faint-hearted. There's been huge conversations about grief and loss, belonging and identity, intergenerational trauma, refugees, being forced to leave your home, trauma theory, and all kinds of things. And I hope that it's just given so much food for thought. I'm not going to have time to speak about every single episode so far, although I would absolutely love to. So I just want to reflect on some of the questions and some of the things that we've talked about on the show so far. The podcast launched with an episode with Christy Lefterry, who at the time, I think we were about a year on from the release of her 3rd novel, Songbirds. So we spoke about The Beekeeper of Aleppo, which was an absolutely heart-rending story, and also Songbirds. I interviewed Christy again a year on, which was a really special full circle moment, as her latest book, The Book of Fire, came into the world, and it was a year on from our last conversation. It was super special. One of the things I really like about speaking to Christy is that not only is she incredibly warm and insightful, but she is very interested in intergenerational trauma. And it's a phrase or a word that lends itself to so many experiences of diaspora communities, people of colour, because it sums up a lot of how we have grown up. It's given us a word for something that I didn't even know was a thing. And trauma occurs in many different ways and shapes and forms and intensities. You may not even realize that something is a form of trauma or traumatic until years later. But what this phrase does is it reminds us that things don't just exist with one person. Humans are interlinked and connected. No man is an island, right? And so when you have families or you have systems, one person's pain or one person's suffering and experience will have a knock-on effect on other people. And dealing with that pain and healing from that trauma and talking about it is what is really important. But circumstances sometimes don't allow for that. And one of the things that has held people back historically, I believe, is not having the right terminology, not being able to say, this is what I'm feeling and here is a word for it. This is what I've experienced and here is a word for it. And this also came up with Suhaima Manzoor-Khan when I spoke to her on the second episode about her book, Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia. Islamophobia is a relatively new term, which means that the everyday experiences that Muslims experience with regards to prejudice or neglect, stereotypes, abuse, and hatred, the everyday experiences that are sometimes so small you could miss them if you blinked, and so small that most other people may not even realize them. But also, they're so massive. When it comes to things like legislation or views or rules on hijab and clothing, these things are big. And so Suhaima and I talked about how having a word to explain your experiences suddenly made everything make sense. Now, I really recommend you go and listen to that episode if you haven't yet already, because we covered so much. And Suhaima is so insightful, super intelligent, and really interesting. Her own experiences of being a young Muslim brown woman in the UK. She grew up in Bradford and she studied at Cambridge, is now working sort of in social justice, but also still in art. It's just really, really interesting. She gave me a lot to think about in terms of what we can do to tackle racism and Islamophobia in the UK and beyond, and why it's so important that we understand it. One of the interesting things that she writes about in the book is the fact that Islamophobia had a beginning. She believes that we can almost pinpoint in history the point at which it began. And anything that has a beginning can have an end. And I love that idea. It means that it isn't something that has always existed in the way that it is today. So if you haven't listened to that one, I really, really suggest you do. Another one of my early guests was Sarish Hussain. Lovely Sarish Hussain has written a stunning novel called The Family Tree, and it was an absolute pleasure to speak to her. Sarish has a new novel coming out in 2024, and I'm sure it is going to be as wonderful as The Family Tree. The reason why I loved the book so much was because not only is it an epic story of family and identity and belonging in the UK, but it was really sincere. It felt really sincere in its representation. We had no cliched storylines or stereotypes. We had fully formed characters that were just trying to live their best life in a society and a community that was so difficult for them. In our conversation, Sarish and I talked a lot about the importance of good representation. And one of the things I loved hearing about was why father and daughter relationships were so important for Sarish to write about. She talks about her own relationship with her father and how actually she feels like she has a very good relationship with him, and if she was in trouble, she could speak to him, and how actually that felt quite rare in certain situations. But the more she talked about it, the more she realized that that was common. And she was so eager to get that out there, because so much of the representation of Muslim men and also Pakistani men more generally is that they're harsh and strict, and that they don't communicate, and that they don't express their emotions. But also some of them lend themselves to ideas of them being very strict when it comes to religion and linking it to terrorism. And Sarish was really adamant to present the other side of things, and I loved speaking to her about it. One of the really interesting things that came up actually was Sarah talked about how you tend to have two forms of representation when it comes to Muslims or people of faith in general. I can't remember the exact terminology because she used a really specific word, but one is, somebody that becomes very hardline with their faith and they end up quite militant. But then the other one is a complete rejection of one's faith. And we see it a lot in literature, I think on TV and on screen more generally, where especially women will leave the faith. So symbolically, there'll be a lot of women taking off their hijab and changing the way they dress significantly, and also cutting off from their families. And it was a really interesting conversation about how both of those representations are actually really difficult sometimes, and they can be really harmful. Because what about all the people that are growing up that want to embrace their faith and their culture and they love it, and maybe there are things that they don't necessarily agree with, but they're happy just being who they are and also thriving? Where is that middle way almost? So yeah, that was also another great conversation. I did say I won't have time to go through all of the episodes, but I'm conscious I've only spoken about 3 so far. I was really honoured to speak to Zulfa Katu back in September about her book, As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow. That book has tugged on the heartstrings of readers all over the world. Zulfa writes so lyrically, tells such an important story about the Syrian war. With a real gentleness, Zulfa tells us clearly about what's going on. She paints a picture that is so vivid and also based on things that we may have seen in the news or on social media, and really finds a way for us to not only understand what's going on, not only feel a connection to it, but understand how important it is for us to do something. Her book is absolutely heart-rending because there is a massive twist that is just so unexpected and really heartbreaking. And I loved speaking to Zulfa about her writing process and why she's so passionate about telling stories from Syria. The book is actually, I think technically it comes under children's fiction or YA, but it's very mature. It's really grown up. I think there are elements of the book that kind of lend itself to a more younger reader in terms of, the complexity within which the story develops or the pace within which it goes. And I think that that's really great because, as Zulfa said to me on the show, it's really important that we continue to speak to young people about these things, and we should understand that we don't need to protect so much, and actually having conversation and having spaces where people can learn and ask questions and relate to beautiful characters and understand what's going on, that it's incredibly important. Honestly, it was such a great conversation, and I'm really honoured that we spoke on the show. I can't wait to read more of her work because I know she's working on more books, and I think it's going to be absolutely fantastic. I also spoke to Shahad Al-Shamari about chronic illness and disability. Her memoir, Head Above Water, published by Neem Tree Press, is a really beautiful account of her own experiences of living with MS and chronic illness and disability more generally. It's really profound, and Shahad shares her experience of being seemingly fine for years of her life and suddenly waking up one day being unable to move. And she describes the way that the illness and the disability worsened over time. And also, what I think was so important was how random it is. Often when we think about disability or illness, there is an assumption that you are a certain level of ill all of the time. But actually, with a lot of chronic illnesses and disability, there is such an element of randomness where you can be completely fine one day and absolutely bedridden the next. And Shahad spoke about this so clearly in her book, really honestly and really openly. One of the things I really loved as well was the way that Shahad spoke about her body almost closing down and not working as in the way that she had previously experienced it to be. She linked it to her own family's experience of being exiled from Palestine. I just thought it was such an fascinating but also really beautiful way of thinking about exile and how the body is also our home. And if suddenly things change for you, it can very much feel like you are losing your home. It was really stunning, and I highly recommend that you read the memoir, especially if you'd like to learn a little bit more about MS and understanding chronic illness and disability a lot better. I had a great time speaking to Tasneem Abdul Rashid about her debut novel, Finding Mr. Perfectly Fine. I have actually come to learn that technically it's not her debut novel, as she has published a book when she lived in Dubai under like a pen name, an alias. So I guess this is actually her second book. But it was such a lovely and like such a fun conversation about finding love and also the stories that we wish we had while growing up. Increasingly, I really believe that love stories are important for people of colour and Black people. I love reading about love. I also quite like writing about it. And I think that we should be celebrating love in all of its forms. But the more I think about it, the more I realise, especially growing up, the love stories that I read were often around either they were, classics, or they were just characters that I couldn't relate to. They didn't resemble me in any way. Their life experiences were so different. And so actually, I think stories like Tasneem's Finding Mr. Perfectly Fine are so important because they not only bring home the importance of love, but also show how finding love or getting married, how those things look in different cultures and what and the shared experiences that so many people have. Now, personally, my own love story is quite epic. And I say it with no irony that my marriage and my relationship with my husband is one of the biggest sources of peace and comfort and joy in my life. I'm so grateful for him, and I'm grateful for God for bringing us together. We were introduced by a friend, and we ended up getting married quite soon after. Things moved very quickly, and looking back on it, it was a bit insane. But I'm so glad that it worked out the way that it did. I didn't spend much time at all really looking for the one. I didn't join any, I didn't use any, of these modern day dating apps or anything like that. But so many people around me, friends and people I really care about, have been having such a difficult time. And Finding Mr. Perfectly Fine by Tasneem Abdul Rashid, I think, explores so many different avenues that people can go through or people do go through in trying to meet the right person. And so I think a lot of people will find so many of the experiences of her characters relatable and interesting and funny. It was very funny. I did laugh a lot throughout the book, but it also brings home a really important message. Her book is great. It's really funny. I laughed a lot, but it also has a really serious undertone, and then it makes us think a lot about love more generally and the experiences that women go through, especially. One of the first conversations I had at the start of 2023 was with Jyoti Patel, who is winner of the Marquee Books Prize, about her book, All the Things That We Lost. I loved speaking to Jyoti. She's so warm and friendly, really, really insightful, and her book is really incredible. It explores mental health, especially for men in the book, but also grief and loss, family, language, and so much more. The mental health element of the book is super interesting because we have the protagonist, Nick, whose mother is Indian and whose father is white British. And what we find actually is a merging of two cultures where neither of whom are open to speaking about mental health. So not only in Indian and I would say more broadly South Asian culture, talking about mental health is a little bit of a taboo. People have really confused views about it. It can be quite difficult. I think things are changing now, but typically it's been something that people just don't talk about. But the same goes for Britain, and especially for men. For so long, there's been this idea of the stiff upper lip, that men are the providers and men are the ones that historically go to war, and you have to be strong and you can't break and you have to provide for your family. For so long, and even for women, I would say, it's been very difficult, even within this Western culture, to speak about mental health. So in Nick, we have somebody who is a fusion of these two cultures that neither of whom speak about mental health. It was just such an interesting exploration. And there's a there's a part in the book that I think about often where Nick goes to university in a city that is very white. And he obviously, because he's mixed race and he's part Indian, gets asked a lot, where are you from? That question is so heavy and so loaded. And Jyoti in her book really sums up why that question is frustrating. She says basically that it comes down to intention. You're either being asked because somebody wants to connect with you. So somebody may be interested in learning more about where you're from, or maybe they've got a connection there, or they're just interested. The other time is when it's because somebody wants to other you. Somebody already feels like you're foreign or you're alien, and they want to be able to put you in a box. And it is a clear form of othering. I think what it comes down to is when you are being asked that question, usually you know why. Usually you understand the intention behind the question because of the circumstances around which you've been asked, or the situation that you're in, or the person that has asked. Maybe they've said something before, or sometimes they're looking at you in a certain way, but you know. Sometimes it's a really welcomed conversation starter almost, and it's great to talk about where you're from if the other person is also talking about where they're from, and it's super interesting and you're sharing and you're learning. But otherwise, it feels so painful and so frustrating because somebody just wants to know, well, what kind of other are you? What kind of brown are you? You're brown, but are you Indian? Are you Pakistani? Are you from Bangladesh? What kind of brown are you? And Dorothy and I spoke about this a lot on the show, and it was just so wonderful and super interesting. So I definitely listen to that if you haven't already. I really wish I could go into more detail about every single author I've interviewed, but I simply don't have time on the show today. One of the things I was really pleased that I did this year was I did a special Ramadan series. So Ramadan ran from sort of the mid to the end of March to the mid to the end of April. And I used the opportunity to connect with Muslim authors that write about faith. It meant a lot to me to be able to explore this and to create a platform for authors to talk about their books in line with faith. I really hope that those listeners who are Muslim and were listening and were fasting gained a lot from these episodes. I think this was actually my highlight of Ramadan. I had such interesting and moving conversations with Rosina Ahad, Dr. Safia Rahman, Alia Umrayan, Suma Din, and Tahir Adil about faith and prayer, justice, prophetic love and guidance, on forgiveness, on being present, on knowing God, on the soul, experiences of women and gratitude, and also on poetry, creativity, and the names of God. It was incredible. I do think even if you're not Muslim, these conversations will be super interesting, really insightful, really open and very warm. I do recommend you have a listen. I'm hoping that next Ramadan we'll have another series, and I hope that it just enriches the experience. I don't think I could have carried on the show in Ramadan without having faith-centric episodes. It means a lot to me, and I really hope that it meant a lot to everyone listening. I also interviewed Channel 4 news reporter and journalist Fatima Manji about her book, Hidden Heritage. That was a really interesting conversation. I was a little intimidated because I've seen Fatima Manji on my screen on the news for absolutely years, and I think that she is incredible. I wasn't sure that I would be able to interview her very well because she herself is an interviewer, but it was such a great conversation about discovering Britain's own hidden heritage. And she talks about things being hidden in plain sight. So, as part of the book, she travels around to different heritage sites in the UK and has a look in understanding what some of the stories are that we don't quite know. It's a really fascinating book. I think it's really accessible, although it is a non-fiction kind of, historical type book. But it's very accessible. It's really easy to read. She's even got some pictures and some samples of some of the things that she writes about. Really fascinating. Honestly, I think you should definitely pick that book up and give the episode a listen if you haven't yet listened. I also interviewed Farah Kareem Cooper about William Shakespeare. So her book, The Great White Bard, is about Shakespeare, race, and the future. And I was so fascinated. I learned so much from Farah about Shakespeare, about theatre productions, about the work happening at the Globe, and it was just so interesting. We also talked about colourblind casting, which I have thought a lot about since as well, because I think diversity in acting and roles given to different people are so important. And I also think if we dig a bit deeper, it's really interesting to think about how if the race of a character is not specified, why the default is always that this is a white person. But like Farah says, I think that if we are going to take a colourblind casting route, it needs to still make sense. So if you're going to have a character played by a black man or a brown woman or an East Asian man, it needs to make sense that their parents or their children are also of the same heritage. I find it a little bit odd when it's completely random because in my brain it doesn't make sense. But I'm very happy to continue this conversation with anyone who is very pro complete colourblind casting. I would love to hear from you. It was really special to speak to Mona Hajar Halabi about her memoir, In My Mother's Footsteps. She talks about returning home to Palestine after decades of being away, and we meet her mother in her book, and it's really, really warm and just so special. I think one of my most funny guests this year has been Huda Fahmy, who is an illustrator. She goes by the name of Yes, I'm Hot in This on social media, and her work is absolutely hilarious. So Huda draws and writes cartoons that deal with the everyday life experiences of herself and her family, but also just people in general. Her work, although her character is called Huda, her work is not autobiographical. Some of it is often inspired by her true life experiences, but not fully. But Huda's also written a few books now as well. And I absolutely loved speaking to her about everything that she's done, about humour and comedy, family, and everyday life. Honestly, I could really just keep going with talking about every single episode that I've had, every single author that I've interviewed on the show, but I can't. It's just going to take too long. But what I really wanted to bring out is not just the number of guests or the diversity of guests or, the names of people, but the kind of conversations that have been happening. I've also talked about things like colonialism and decolonizing literature and retelling history and what we can do to create a more just world. I love the fact that this space so far has been about big questions, but it's all about books. speaking to people that write books that themselves have loved books. I tend to ask authors about books that have inspired them or have been important to them on their writing journey, and I love hearing different things from them. This space means so much to me, and I hope that it means a lot to you too. And I cannot wait for more conversations, more interesting topics, more brilliant books. And I really hope that you'll continue and stay with me. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, it would really help me if you could follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with social media. It would mean the world if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.